So what if heavy weapon teams but bigger? Let's take a look at the new Field Ordnance batteries rules and talk about how strong they're looking in the new Guard Codex. Hello and welcome back to Auspex Tactics, where today we're talking Guard once more, and I thought we'd continue in our look through the full rules of the Astra Militarum Codex with a really focused look at the Field Ordnance batteries, how I'd field them, what sort of support they might want, and compare their damage against a few competitors within the book. These things are basically big, cool-looking heavy weapon teams. They get 3 crew rather than 2, and a bigger gun to fire with. They're first going to be available in this Cadia Stands Army Set box. That's up for pre-order at the time of recording. I'll leave a link to Element Games in the UK, where you can get it for a bit cheaper if desired. The link also helps out Auspex Tactics if you buy through it, at no extra cost to yourself. I suspect that they will be releasing individually at a later date, and it seems they come in sets of 2, despite Games Workshop showing off all 3 variants in the one picture here. First up, let's start with their datasheet, and the Field Ordnance batteries are a heavy support choice in Codex Astra Militarum. 130 points for the unit, you can only take 2 models, no more no less, and you can choose to equip each of them with any of the 3 different variants of guns shown here. Statline wise, they're an artillery unit, weirdly neither designated either as an infantry unit or a vehicle unit, a bit of an anomaly in recent books in 40k there, and they've got a bit of a halfway house stat line, a movement of 6 inches, hit on 4s, strength 3 and toughness 4, 6 wounds, 3 attacks, leadership 7 and a 4+ save. Being neither infantry nor vehicles, it does appear that they'll be able to move and fire those heavy weapons at no penalty. It does seem a little bit odd to me given the size of the gun and the fact that they're man-portable, but I guess that's handy enough if you want to set them up behind terrain and then move into it. I'd say the defensive stat line is a bit of a weakness, to be honest. Just about any gun will chew them up fairly nicely. Both anti-tank weapons and anti-infantry weapons will be really quite good against them, which isn't an awesome place to be in. A bit better than the heavy weapon squads that die to a stiff breeze, but not by a massive amount per point, to be honest. Otherwise, in terms of keywords, they get artillery, regimental, and platoon. They don't get core though, so they won't be getting reroll auras from things like Cady and Castellans. Artillery could give them a +1 to hit with expert bombardiers though. Regimental gives them the doctrines, which is handy, and platoon gives them orders. We'll mention them later, but take aim seems pretty much mandatory. Weapon-wise, they all cost the same, and they can all fire 48-inch range. You either get the heavy Lascannon, Malleus rocket launcher, and Bombast field gun. You can mix and match, but to be honest I wouldn't, and keep the unit focused on one target. The heavy Lascannon is a great big anti-tank gun, 2 shots at strength 10, AP -4, and damage D3+3. Not a gun that most vehicles are going to want to get hit by. While there's still the potential to be hit by these, your opponent can't really say that their vehicles are safe. We'll compare them against a few other anti-tank guns in a second. Next up, there's the Malleus rocket launcher, D6+6 shots at strength 6, AP -1, damage 1, and blast. Despite kind of looking like a barrage weapon, it seems not to be. A direct fire anti-infantry weapon that'll shoot with an average of around about 10 shots. Against the right target it will be pretty lethal, but it's not really much of a take-all-comers weapon, as there'll be a lot of matchups where it's just going to feel very weedy indeed. I feel out of the 3 of them it's the one with the most challenges. Hordes just aren't super common in the meta at the moment. If they were, it would be a lot better. Finally there's the Bombast field gun, D6 shots at strength 7, AP -2 and damage 2, basically a little earthshaker cannon. It does get the blast keyword and ignores line of sight this time, so you can hit targets that you can't see. Currently the Guard Dex is a little bit in limbo as to whether or not they're going to receive the exemption from that barrage rule that they had before. Whether or not they retain that will make a massive difference as to how strong this is. If they lose their exemption, then as per the balance data state that would make them -1 to hit and the AP one worse, severely cutting the damage of this thing. Finally, each squad also gets 2 las guns for a tiny bit of chip damage if the enemy gets too close. And I would also mention that the base does look really quite a big one for these guys. You might struggle to hide too many of them behind terrain. They might well be fighting for space with other things. In general, I think they are a unit that needs to be carried by their raw firepower, as they aren't enormously tough and they're certainly not that fast, so it depends on whether or not their firepower when stacked with buffs can be worth it. Talking of buffs and things, starting out we've got regimental doctrines. Basically anything that amps up firepower is going to be good here. Born Soldiers is okay if you're using it. For targets that you'd be wounding on a 3+, it's around about a 10% damage boost more or less, depending on whether or not you're using Take Aim. It's maybe a little bit more useful for the Malleus launchers and the Bombast guns, as they're going to sometimes be targeting things that they're wounding on a 4 or 5. Otherwise, Elite Sharpshooters is generally useful. A single hit reroll is fine, and it's actually quite good on the las cannons. Definitely makes them a little bit more efficient there. Expert Bombardiers gives you +1 to hit, even without the order for those Bombast field guns. and it does work for the direct line of sight weapons as well. In general though, take aim isn't really the hardest thing to have around in the army. You only need to hit one unit with and then it can splash to multiple, so it can be quite efficient. I guess maybe it's a bit of an added incentive to take these guys though if you are running that regiment. As mentioned, I think if you're running these, you definitely want to have Take Aim as the order on standby. It's not really that expensive to have in the army. A cheap Cadian Castellan could be 50 points and give it to multiple different units, as well as using his other order for something else and some other infantry nearby maybe. These things just really don't seem to be all that efficient without the +1 to hit and the extra pip of AP, so I would want an officer to order that. Otherwise, if for whatever reason that one wasn't really needed for the extra damage output, you could think about taking cover for light cover on the unit, giving them an effective 3+ save, or maybe suppression fire on something like the Malleus launchers. They could be an okay choice to hand out the -1 to hit to an infantry squad, as they're probably going to get enough hits to make that trigger. They can take the Prefector's orders, but to be honest they're a bit niche. I feel like you'd be using Take Aim 90% of the time. Character-wise, not being core does mean that they do have some limited things. I'd say the single best characters for them, though, are Ursula Creed and the Master of the Ordnance. Both of those give you some direct increase to your firepower, which is the main thing for this unit. When Creed issues an order to one of them, you get +1 strength, which will be very nice for the Bombast field guns, and maybe even the Malleus launchers to get to strength 7. You're probably going to be issuing Take Aim to them anyway, so getting +1 strength on the one that the order targets is quite a nice bonus. The Master of the Ordnance is a 25-point upgrade on the command squad. He gets 2 nominated targets for all artillery to re-roll a hit roll of 1 against, and this does apply to any of the different variants, so that could be quite a nice cheap way to get a hit re-roll of 1 on the unit. If you've got a command squad anyway, then he's not a bad bolt-on. I'm not sure if he's quite enough to justify the command squad all by himself in one order though. Otherwise, theoretically, you could use the Lord Solar and Psychers to give some rerolls to the unit or make them tougher. To be honest, I wouldn't really bother with either though. They're just going to be better targets for those buffs. 130 points isn't that bad, but when the same buffs could be affecting things like tank commanders or Rogol Dawn battle tanks, they're just not going to be quite worth it. Finally, the Laurels of Command could be a maybe upgrade for a once per game burst of taking cover in the enemy's turn. Could allow them to take aim in your turn and take cover in the opponent's. Still though, maybe a slightly marginal durability upgrade for 1 CP. In general, in terms of support, I'd say that these guys are just a little bit better in any of those damage-dealing shooting regiments. You almost certainly want Take Aim for them, and if Creed happens to be about, then getting the +1 strength on those Bombast does seem like she could maybe be worth the upgrade over the regular Cadian Castellan just for that boost, never mind the bonus orders. Stratagems wise, again, maybe as a slightly low cost unit, they're maybe not that worth spending too many points on. I guess maybe some of the most useful ones could be Vengeance for Cadia. Getting a +1 to wound against Chaos could be quite nice. That affects a Cadian unit or a platoon unit, and these are one of the more threatening platoon units, and getting +1 to wound with Lascannons, Bombast guns, or rocket launchers seems great. Otherwise, overlapping fields could be okay if you're shooting lots of guns to target one thing. You get to reroll wound rolls of 1 and 6s to wound, gain an extra pip of AP against the target. That'll be a little bit better with Born Soldiers as well. And they potentially might not be the worst unit to target with a command reroll. If you fail to wound with a heavy Lascannon, wounding a 3+ save vehicle on a 3+, then doing that command reroll could net you a damage of around about 3 or 4 wounds. That's not bad return on your investment. Otherwise, maybe rerolling a 1 and the number of shots with the Bombast gun could be okay. Doesn't seem quite as exciting as maybe doing the same for something like a Manticore though. In general, I'd largely just let them do their own thing, maybe the odd command reroll or Vengeance for Cadia here or there. Next up, I thought we'd look at some damage output for the Lascannons and the Bombasts, and just see how they compete against their competitors within the Codex. I'm going to assume Take Aim for these comparisons, just as it's really easy to get, and you only need 1 order spare to issue it to multiple units. Seems pretty reasonable and low investment. That'd give those Lascannons 4 shots at Ballistic Skill 3+, a Strength 10, a Crazy -5, and Damage D3+3, equating to around about 2 Marines, 1 or 2 Terminators, an average of 9 wounds to a Toughness 7 or 8 vehicle, and about 5 wounds to a hard target, a vehicle with a 5+ invul and -1 damage. Overall doesn't seem too bad for 130 points, obviously far more efficient against the big tough vehicles than the heavy infantry. Just for the sake of comparison, I weighted a Lehman Russ Executioner with a Lascannon to 130 points, and this will be a comparable damage. The Executioner does better against the heavy infantry, but slightly worse against the vehicle targets, a little bit less good against the Toughness 7 vehicle, and significantly less good against the -1 damage vehicle, as that doesn't like the damage 3. I did make a video comparing the different Lehman Russ turrets, which you can check out yesterday. The Executioner does really quite well as a general purpose one. If you'd say compared a Demolisher or Vanquisher, it would have been a bit better against the tough vehicles and a bit less good against the heavy infantry. Overall, in terms of raw damage, I think that they're at least reasonably comparable. I do feel that maybe the overall numbers work in the tank's favour more so than the weapon teams, though. I feel like these guys probably need to have better damage output than a Lehman Russ tank to really justify themselves as the better option. The tank does have a number of different advantages, moves a lot faster, is a lot tougher with toughness 8 and a 2+ save, can take some very cheap sponsons, and also can get order buffs of its own which we haven't included here. I suspect if you just want raw firepower to kill heavies, the tanks are probably the way to go. I thought it would be also kind of interesting to weigh them up against the old-style heavy weapon teams. These of course also getting new models of their own. A team with the Lascannons cost you 55 points, and again I've run some numbers with them also getting take aim, and weighted to the 130 points that the heavy Lascannons would get. Overall, in terms of raw firepower, the heavy weapon teams do outperform the heavy Lascannons against all targets, but to be fair that's probably to be expected. At only 2 wounds at toughness 3 with a 5+ save, these guys really do die to a stiff breeze. It only takes a few bolters to look their way to ruin the squad. Otherwise though, they do have some other advantages and weaknesses. They do take the movement penalty when they move and shoot those Lascannons, which isn't great, but they are core units and they are infantry, both of which are small advantages over this artillery piece. In general, I feel like maybe like this unit, you might just be better off with things that hide out of line of sight and aren't taking damage on fairly fragile profiles as they go. Speaking of which, that brings us on to the Bombast field gun. Again, I thought we'd do a damage comparison against a tank and a heavy weapon team. For the purposes of these numbers, I'm going to assume that we're not taking the barrage penalty from the balanced data slate. Again, that's kind of up in the air at the moment. Take aim lands you 2d6 shots at strength 7, AP 3 and damage 2, hitting on a 3+. Theoretically could be up to a strength 8 if Creed's the one doing the order, which would be pretty cool. At strength 7 though, it equates to 4 guardsmen dead, around 2 dead marines, around 1 terminator, 4 wounds to a toughness 7 vehicle, and only 1 wound on average each turn to a hard target. I thought I'd compare that to a Manticore, which compared with the Basilisk does seem to win in the majority of categories besides against light infantry, though to be honest the Manticore's numbers aren't particularly exciting in this comparison I must admit. It loses out by a fair bit against the light infantry and the Space Marines, is about the same on the Terminators, fractionally ahead on the toughness 7 vehicle but not meaningfully, and only really any good against the hard target to be honest. It is a big leg up wounding on 3s rather than wounding on 5s. Overall I do feel that the bombard guns compete pretty decently against the Manticore to be honest. If you're just taking a unit that's just going to be sitting behind terrain and lobbing shells at the enemy, I think you could definitely make an argument for the bombast guns. The Manticore does have its advantages again though, faster and a bit tougher. It can take tank orders, and in particular expert bombardiers would give you a decent leg up if and when you trigger it, as that could be a way for the Manticore to also get a 3+ ballistic skill. Overall though, the new Bombast do seem pretty solid. I thought I'd also put in the numbers for the mortars as well. Obviously these guys are far more focused on killing light infantry, so maybe aren't direct competitors. As you'd expect, they kill far more of the guardsmen than the Bombasts, are a little bit worse on the Space Marines, solidly worse on the Terminators and the Toughness 7 vehicles, but weirdly slightly better against hard targets, where -1 damage and wounding on 5s kind of ruins the Bombast. I think mortars are probably the most interesting heavy weapons to be honest. They can remain hidden so their bad durability isn't really an issue. To be honest, from these numbers alone, if you had to choose one or the others, it does look kind of close between the heavy weapon mortars and the bombasts. They are surprisingly close against a bunch of targets. Mass low AP shots not doing terribly against the heavies just because you get more of them. So overall, if I was using them in game, as mentioned, I'd certainly take an officer with take aim to support them, maybe either Creed or a Master of Ordnance if it was convenient. The bombasts just want to stay hidden and shoot, ideally against 2 wound infantry. The heavy lascannons or the Malleus launchers, they'd want to hide behind terrain and then use their movement to get line of sight and open fire turn 1 if possible. I guess theoretically against some armies you might be able to sit at the back and outrange most of their dangerous firepower. If that's an option with a 48-inch range, then all well and good I guess. Otherwise they could sit around on objectives and just give you a little bit more presence there in case infantry are killed, and ideally you really wouldn't want your opponent getting into combat with these. They can't fire in combat unlike vehicles and things, and they're not exactly that hard to take out in melee with only a 4+ save and toughness 4. Overall, in terms of how strong they are in the Guard Codex, I think they're kind of middling. Probably not one of the absolute standout power units of the book, but pretty usable if you want them and they make sense for your list. I'd say both the Lascannons and the Malleus launchers look okay compared with the things that are directly competing against them, but I feel like maybe for both of them, if you want direct damage dealers, you're probably going to be best off with battle tanks that can take a punch as well as give one out. The Bombast do seem decently strong though. They compete decently with Manticores, Basilisks and Mortars, and seem particularly nice with Creed, so they could be quite a safe choice to use when they don't need to rely on their durability. Let me know what you think though. Could you see yourself using a unit or two of these when we finally get our hands on the new models? If you've enjoyed the video, then feel free to subscribe to Auspex Tactics. I'll certainly be keeping a bunch of guard stuff coming over the next couple of weeks, plenty of unit reviews and overviews of the different rule sections, so feel free to subscribe or check back later if you'd like to see that. If you'd like to check out a recent one, I'll leave a link to my comparison of the Lehman Russ battle tank turrets down in the video description. Otherwise, if you have been getting good value out of these videos, there's also the Patreon page linked down there in the description. The channel's Patreon is what allows me to keep on making videos like this quite so regularly, so if you are enjoying quite a bit, any support is enormously appreciated. Channel patrons do get a few advantages, including seeing certain videos early, regular votes to see what sort of things come next on the channel, and automatic entry into the regular prize giveaways with a chance to win some big model kits each month. If any of that sounds good to you, or you'd just like to help support, then check out the link below. In any case, an enormous thank you for listening, and I'll hope to see you guys next time.